Hello, everybody, and welcome. We'll give it just a minute because we've got a big full house today. So as you are joining us, if you'd like to go ahead and put into the chat box where you're joining us from in the Central Valley, we would love to see that. It's always fun. Modesto, hello, Adriana, nice to see you. Or Mariposa, lovely.
Good morning, everybody. Or good afternoon. I guess we're
Yes,
good
officially
afternoon.
afternoon. Yeah. I was waiting to say that, so there you go.
Thank you for joining us for lunch.
What is anybody eating? Let's put that in the chat. I'm hungry. All right. We'll get started. So again, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Proper Steps of a Legal Termination webinar. Today sponsored by the Central Valley Hotline. We want to welcome you all. My name is Tara Brennan, and I'm the events manager here at CEA. And before we start, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping details with you. Your audio is muted, but we do love your participation. So if you have any questions pertaining to this actual presentation, please put those into the Q&A box that's located down at kind of the left-hand side middle part of the box that'll appear. That's where our presenters will be kind of monitoring and being able to answer those questions as we go. If for whatever reason you did not receive the handouts that went along with the reminder email with the link, go ahead and put your email address into the chat box. That's where I will be, and I will be able to help you out with the handouts. And if you've got any technical difficulties, I can try to help you out there. Just a reminder that there will be a survey at the end of this. So please take the 3 seconds it'll take to fill out the 6 questions. We really appreciate your feedback. We are here to serve you and to help you. And we would really love to have your input on that. So I believe that that is all I have in terms of housekeeping. And so now let me go ahead and introduce our 2 speakers. Today we have Mary Bradford and Eli Nunez, 2 of our HR directors here at CEA.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Looking forward to spending the next hour or so with you. Mary has graciously joined us today. She will be, if you will, the wizard behind the curtain. Any questions you have, she will use her expertise to give you all the guidance you need to make sure that we are staying out of trouble, which is our goal, right? As we talk about proper steps of legal termination.
Yeah, just make sure everyone you throw those in the Q&A box. That's where I will be. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Mary. And before we get started, I'd like to remind everybody, thank you for joining us from the Central Valley. The Central Valley Counties has partnered with us at California Employers Association to provide that no-cost HR hotline for all the different counties. So here you can see all the numbers available to you from wherever you're joining us. Please don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you. And if you have any questions on anything related to HR issues, whether it's hiring, terminations, leaves of absence, which we know can be confusing, especially in California, FMLA, CFRA, breaks, meal periods, employee handbooks. It's the end of the year, so make sure that you're getting those handbooks updated, either doing your updates or giving us a call. We can help with that as well. Harassment prevention or any kind of questions with the remote workforce. This is obviously, we've been doing this for a couple of years at working remotely, but it's still something that's relatively new. And there's always questions coming up, so please give us a call. I'll leave those numbers up here for a bit, and then we'll show them again at the end of our presentation. A little bit about us before we jump into it. We are CEA, or California Employers Association, and our goal is to provide our members or anybody that calls us with peace of mind. We do that by providing guidance on any human resources compliance issues, solutions. We provide training, recruiting services. Basically, we try to help with everything we can on the HR side of your business so that you can focus on everything else, growing your business or any of the day-to-day, right? So what we try to offer is just quick, responsive answers to any HR questions. We also have some forms that we can share with our members, handbooks, guidelines, fact sheets, trainings, whether it's for supervisors, managers, or employees, as well as consultation on workplace issues, labor negotiations, any investigations, that sort of thing. So those are all services that we offer. Please feel free to contact us, again, either through your hotline, or if you're interested in membership with us, give us a call. Having said that, though, one thing that we are not is we are not lawyers. We're not a legal firm. And even though we do have people with legal experience on our staff, our our purpose is not to provide you with legal guidance, right? And this goes with this presentation as well. This is for educational purposes, not to be taken as legal advice. Many reasons for that, of course. I mean, if there is a question of legal significance for you, we want you to consult with your own legal counsel in order to preserve that attorney-client privileges and to get the best advice possible in the legal arena. So now that we got the housekeeping out of the way there, let's talk a little bit about some of the topics we'll touch today. So our goals for today are to learn why documentation is your best friend when it comes time for a separation or a termination, right? And that's something that you hear from us over and over, documentation, documentation, documentation. Well, we'll talk about that today and how that plays into the whole process. We'll also talk about how coaching and discipline work together. Sometimes those terms are used interchangeably in the workforce, but we'll talk about them separately to see how they differ and how they both play a big part in how we manage our workforce. And of course, avoiding legal problems when it's time to terminate or when it comes to terminations, right? That is really our goal of this presentation, to help give you some knowledge, some tools in order to help avoid any of that possible ugliness. So, first question I'd like to hear is, we talk a lot about documentation. So what is employee documentation to you? What's it look like? How do you define that? If you want to throw just a quick 1 or 2 word answer or a couple word answer in the Q&A, I really like to see kind of what everybody's thoughts is on this. And really the thing with documentation to keep in mind too is, for the most part, it doesn't have to be very lengthy, right? A documentation doesn't have to be, a 2, 3, 4 pages on something, right? A lot of people ask that, do you have to wait until a certain number of time to get feedback, especially with new hires? Do you have to have an established 30, 60, 90 days to get feedback? And honestly, for the most part, no. What we'd like to encourage with our members and with any participants is, give constant feedback and document that feedback as you go along, right? Whether it's, coaching, counseling, whether it's, drawing attention to things that are being done incorrectly. If you're talking about it with your employees or with your team, we want to have some kind of feedback, whether it's, in the form of an email trail, that sort of thing, performance reviews, write-ups, some of the things that are popping up here for us. Any notes of conversations, that sort of thing. These are all important building blocks for management. Another question we get often is, as far as documentation, does it have to be written? Well, just by the very nature of being documentation, yes, it should be. It should be either written physically, either on a report or some kind of email, something we can refer back to that's not just, word spoken, hearsay, or that sort of thing. And finally, when it comes to documentation, you always want to make sure that it is a dialogue, so to speak, right? It's not just, you talking to somebody, lecturing somebody, and then walking away without giving them a chance to respond, right? Because at the end of the day, we do want to, seek to understand why certain things are happening and how we can prevent it. So always make sure that when we talk about documentation, see it almost as a dialogue, right? We want to take into account the other person's point of view or the other person's perception of things. Okay. Now, when it comes to define documentation, when we're actually documenting an incident, we want to make sure that we're talking about what's important to the business. How does this relate to the business, right? Why are we even addressing this? What's the purpose of us taking this exercise? Many times you can talk about the structure, expectations, or even the conduct that we're addressing, right? It's very important too, when we document something, that we're talking about not only what has happened, but some of the consequences or some of the effects that this has or has had on the workforce, right? We're not just focusing on, hey, this happened. We're focusing on, this happened, and this is why it's important to address it. This is what resulted of it, or this is what may result of it. So this is why we're addressing this issue. It's also, documentation can also be used for things like pay, promotion, or any kind of benefits that are linked to the position as well. And it can also give us guidance on what to do when things don't go as we plan them, right? I mean, we go into things with the very best of intentions, whether it's a new hire, starting a new job, that sort of thing. But sometimes things go sideways. So we want to have that documentation to help us address why it happened and to redirect things as needed. And also, we want to make sure that when we're documenting any issue, by having that conversation with the employees, we want to make sure that we're taking into account their rights as employees, right? Making sure that there's no discrimination involved with what we're doing, or if the employee is asking for help or additional training, making sure that we're documenting that. And if we are providing that training, making sure we're also including that in the documentation in case it comes back down the road. Okay. So let's talk about why we want to document things. And the first thing is, from an employee's perspective, is if we document something, it shows that it was serious enough to be written down, right? It's not just a conversation in passing. It's not just a comment. It's not just, some quick advice. If we're documenting something, that carries some certain weight with employees, right? This is going to go in the employee file. This is going to be referenced, or this could be referenced for the future, whether it's for, review purposes or any other thing. So once we document something, it can become a part of that employee file, and we can use it for management, from a management perspective going forward, whether it's to, readdress the issue if it happens again, or to correct any issues that come from it, right? Now, as far as the importance of it for the employer, think of it as almost like building blocks, right? When you have this documentation, you're laying a foundation for making decisions down the road, and for also having a defense for yourself to show that you are addressing issues in your workplace in a non-discriminatory manner. You're treating everybody equally and not playing favorites with anybody, right? So that's where, if you have that consistent documentation with everybody, it's going to show that there's no favoritism. You're treating everybody equally, and you're addressing these issues as they come up. Now, if you look at the slide, we have a few points on there. Obviously, we got detail the expectations that were discussed with the employees, offer a history of performance over time. That's why it's important to have that consistent documentation throughout an employee's career, right? We're going to use it as evidence to support management decisions to take any actions, whether they're unfavorable or favorable. So if we're documenting somebody's performance improvements or in a positive way, we can use that down the road for any promotions or that sort of thing. Or if it's something not as positive, you can use it to support any unfavorable actions down the road, whether it's a disciplinary action, termination, that sort of thing. And we can also use it as proof to justify salary increases. As you know, going forward, there's going to be a lot of emphasis placed on pay ranges in California. Make sure that that information is more visible. Well, this documentation, or by having proper documentation, you can use it as justification for salary increases in certain people and avoid any kind of claims of favoritism, retaliation, that sort of thing. So one thing to notice too is those words that are in green in that slide. If you take a look at them, they look almost like legal terms, right? Details, history, evidence, proof, that sort of thing. And that's by design, right? Because these are the kind of things that we can use as defense as an organization down the road, should we find ourselves in some kind of claim or some kind of court case. So the question comes up, again, how do we document things? And some of the advice we give is documentation should always be written during the meeting with the employee, right? And you can't always be writing everything word for word, but make sure you're taking notes when the conversation happens. Note important points of it, and immediately following the conversation, make sure you document, you write that report at the earliest, as early as possible, right? Because if you think about it, I mean, something that happens today, how good is our memory? Are we going to be able to remember all the details a couple days from now, or a week from now, or a month from now? If you have to go back and document something based on memory, there's a good chance you could either miss important details or skew it based on certain perceptions. So you want to make sure you document as close to the event or circumstance as possible, right? Documentation should be professional, neat, and organized. Again, if you find yourself where you have to present this documentation to defend yourself against the claim, you want to be sure that it is professional and neat in order to be considered valid, or to avoid any kind of any kind of it not taken seriously due to its presentation, right? And it's important to think, I mean, when you're writing documentation, think about it as if you're talking about the history or the event to a third party, right? Somebody that may not be completely familiar with the circumstance. You want to make sure that it's understandable to them, because in some cases it could be an outside party that's looking at this documentation to make any determinations about an incident. As always, you want to make sure we're stating the employee's behavior and actions related to an incident or an event. Some things to avoid, or some things that are to be seen as bad documentation. Obviously, the first one is opinions, and there's a few examples on there. Again, opinions can be seen as just you injecting your preconceived notions or your prejudices into the documentation. So we want to avoid that, right? We want to stick to facts more than anything on there. Again, avoid using labels, whether it's this person's irresponsible, that person's not a team player. Again, stick to the facts of the circumstance on there. And then again, we're not trying to interpret the reason why an employee is behaving a certain way or did a certain thing, right? As I mentioned, it's important to try to understand why certain things happen. But again, we can't really always interpret why things happen. We could see them from our point of view, but again, by just listing or documenting the facts of the matter, that's what we're going to focus on when it comes time to make a decision. Again, avoid the use of any descriptive words or adjectives that could be seen as painting a negative light or injecting an opinion into it. Things like slowly, moody, cranky, that sort of thing. Those are all words that can, if you put them into documentation, it looks like you're injecting or coloring the situation based on your own perception of it, right? So again, documentation, we want to stick to the facts, be fair, legal, objective, complete, and most importantly, consistent. You want to have that consistency across your workforce. That's just going to help make that documentation valid further down the road. So things that we want to document, of course, or in our documentation, we want to make sure that we're describing what we're there to discuss, right? Whether it's a specific issue, whether it's a violation of company policy, or any kind of concern that's going on, we want to make sure that that is described in the documentation. Of course, if we're sticking with facts, dates, times, that sort of thing, those are very important to list, especially if there's been any previous conversations of the situation and it occurs again. We want to make sure that we are noting those in the documentation as well. The impact of the employee's behavior, right? As I said, why are we addressing it? What has that behavior caused? Is that behavior, caused a loss of productivity? Is it affecting the rest of the workforce? What is that behavior affecting? That sort of thing. The meeting outcome or next steps. Again, we are going to hopefully list some kind of resolution to the meeting, right? These are the expectations. This is what we need to happen. Otherwise, this will happen. You could say basically listing the expectations of the meeting, right? This is what we expect to come out of this meeting. This is what should happen to correct the behavior, the incident, etc. And it's very important, when we're documenting something, if something is serious enough to be documented, we want to make sure we're scheduling some kind of follow-up or we're revisiting the issue, right? It's not something where you just, have one conversation, document it, and hope it gets fixed. We want to make sure that we follow up and revisit it to make sure that it was corrected. And again, as usual, make sure that you are documenting things as soon as possible, hopefully as soon as they happen, so that you don't miss any details or issues there. So when it comes down to this documentation process, a lot of times there's organizations that depend or lean very heavily on either the human resources department or upper management to do it. Supervisors or leads will just hand off the problem and hope that it gets taken care of. And in some circumstances it works. In others, though, having a well-trained supervisor that knows how to handle these issues is important, right? So hopefully your supervisors have a well-documented coaching practice, right? they know how to engage their employees, how to coach their employees along, rather than just pointing out mistakes, berating, or just having negative interactions. We want to have that positive coaching relationship, right? Again, consistency, and this is something else to train supervisors and managers, and make sure that we're being consistent with our workforce when we address these issues across the board. We don't want there to be any thought that there's favoritism or any perception of favoritism, for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, it could lead to legal issues. The other one, though, it's going to diminish the impact of any kind of coaching or corrective action we do. If it's seen as not being fair or not being consistent, it's less likely to be taken seriously or be taken as valid by the employee. And finally, when you're either engaged in a coaching session with an employee or any kind of disciplinary action, make sure that you are aware of the rights of the employee. Whether that's making sure that you're only addressing issues related to performance, or if you're taking any action, make sure that it's not due for anything that could be illegal, which we will discuss in the future. And now these are important, these 3 points, because it's been found that when a supervisor has that well-documented coaching practice, they're consistent and they're aware and protect their employees' rights, it leads to a very much more engaged workforce. And as you know, I mean, the lack of engagement in the workforce has so many issues that employers deal with today, whether it's turnover, whether it's just bad, a toxic work environment, that sort of thing. Having that engaged workforce is very, very important. And the Gallup Management Organization actually, they do some polling, they do some studies, and they found that within the US workforce, up to $300 billion are lost in productivity alone just due to having disengagement in the workforce, right? And they found that, in contrast, in other organizations where there is a higher engagement, productivity, retention, all those good things that we strive for are definitely much higher than in other situations. So again, make sure that as supervisors, we're following these 3 guidelines to continue that engagement with our employees. I talked about coaching versus disciplining, or coaching versus corrective action, that sort of thing. And really, coaching is just how you engage your employees whenever there's a work-related issue, right? So as a coach, you want to create a space for employees where they can engage with you, tell their story, let you know of any issues in the workplace, right? Now, you think as a coach, our job is not just to give instructions and walk away and hope things happen. As a coach, we're constantly looking at the process, what's going wrong, what can we correct, what can we improve, or even helping with any barriers, right? This isn't happening because this process needs to be improved. As a coach, we can go in, take a look, and help to fix that, right? So it's really allowing our employees to be their best and to do what they can. I mentioned, as a coach, we want to make sure that we create that space for employees to talk to us. That doesn't mean that we're just there to let them vent or unload on us or anything, right? But it does mean that we give them time and we create that relationship to where they can offer some kind of constructive input, or let us know of any concerns, not just complaining about them, but actually helping to come up with some solutions. All right. Let's talk about one issue that comes up is employees who are either unwilling to correct something or unable to do so. Okay. So in this case, documentation is so critical because it shows a couple of things. One, shows that the employee was aware of the expectations. And that's so important, with a new employee or with an existing employee, they have to know where they stand and what's expected of them. Otherwise, how are they going to know that they're falling short of the mark, right? This helps show that we also want to know that the employee is capable of performing their job or knows how to perform their job. So if there's any documentation of training or any documentation of corrective action to address an issue, we want to make sure that that's there, right? If the employee failed to meet a reasonable standard, that is important to document as well, right? And of course, we want to make sure the employee has the knowledge and the awareness, and that we provide them the tools to the job. If they still cannot do it, that's when we're documenting it as well. And again, we want to show that as employers, we're giving our employees the opportunity to succeed, to do their job, and we're treating them fairly. So we have an example here of what could possibly happen or what could possibly go wrong with if documentation is not consistent or if documentation is not appropriate. In this case, we have an example of a 61-year-old dietitian named Carol who had positive performance reviews for 20 years until a new supervisor was hired. When the new supervisor started, they said Carol was making mistakes in preparing menus for patients, and Carol was no longer competent and could either accept another position, take a severance package, or be discharged. At this point, the employee sued for age discrimination. In this instance, initially, courts found for the employer. However, once further on the appeal, once further they looked into a little bit further, it turned out that there was, again, this documentation worked against them, right? You have 20 years of positive reviews. So this employee's been doing their job positively for 20 years. All of a sudden, new supervisor's hired, and then things start going sideways. Well, they looked into a little further, and they found that the person's performance, even though there was some mistakes made, still fell within the range, the acceptable range that they had. So ultimately, in this case, it was found in favor of the employee that indeed, the circumstances at least seem to indicate that the action was taken because of her age. Another example that this one may, it's more of a day-to-day thing that many employers deal with sometimes. In this case, we have an employee that's been late multiple times in the month. So 2 weeks ago, they were late for 10 minutes. Today, they're late for 15 minutes. And, you notice it, right? It's happened 2 weeks ago. It happened again today. So what should we do? In this case, we're going to have a coaching session, right? Sit down with the employee, talk about the issue, talk about the tardiness and the impact. It's affecting the rest of the workforce, start times, or what have you. Get their side of the story, but make sure that they're familiar with the policy or restate the policy to them, the expectations, and then let them know that the next step in the disciplinary process, right? So in this case, it could just be coaching, but let them know that what can happen if it continues, right? Encourage better performance, and then document the issue. Even though this could just be a conversation, make sure you document it, whether it's a follow-up email with them or even some kind of written record that goes in their file. Now, in this case, if it happens again, what do we do? Again, this example, we had 10 minutes late 2 weeks ago, 15 minutes last week. Today, there was a 20-minute tardy. Well, in this example, it may be time for a written warning, right? So we're going to summarize what happened. Again, we're going to give clear instructions regarding the performance. So, whether it's no more tardies for this week, no more tardies for the month, or what have you, you're going to come up with that realistic goal for that, right? State the next step, which is additional, in this case, it's additional disciplinary action up to and including termination, and then offer encouragement. We want this person to succeed, but at the same time, we want to hold them accountable for the violation of policy, right? Now, a question we get often is, so what happens if the employer refuses to sign the documentation? And this is something that maybe employees believe, well, if I don't sign it, it doesn't count. If I don't sign it, you can't put it on my file. That is not necessarily the case, right? I mean, this isn't a contract where the employee has to sign for it to be valid. We're documenting an issue. If they refuse to sign whether it's a report, a warning, a write-up, whatever you want to call it, just make sure you document that on the form, initial it, and file it. That can still be used down the road for further steps in the disciplinary action. Okay. So the issues in our example have continued, right? I mean, in this example, we see, again, the recap. We have a fourth time this person's late. We have a tardiness 2 weeks ago. Again, last week, 3 days ago, it was 20 minutes late. And today it's 12 minutes late. So at this point, you've given Holly coaching, you've given her discipline. She knows the policy, what the policy is. You've documented that she knows the policy. There's another violation. So at this point, you have some options. And really, it's going to depend on your company's policy, and again, what the impact of the tardiness is, right? So you can either issue another warning, Or if you want, you can escalate to the next step, which, once you get past a certain number of, whether it's warnings or write-ups or what have you, then the next step would be termination, which we'll talk about here coming up. So when it comes time to terminate an employee, one thing that we like to say at CEA is, fire fast. We like to say hire slow and fire fast, right? And we'll tell you why. So when you're hiring slow, you're taking your time, you're making sure you know the requirements and you're getting the right person in. Firing fast means once that decision is made and everything's in a row, we're going to not dilly-dally on it, right? Once the decision is made for termination, we are going to move towards it. So another example to illustrate why this is so important here. We have an employee, that's Jane, that's been insubordinate and instigating arguments with coworkers. So in this case, Jane's supervisor, David, decided it was time to terminate Jane. He spoke to HR about the decision on Monday, and the company decided they would terminate Jane on a Friday. Seems reasonable, right? But as some of you that have been through our webinars before or have talked to us know, there could be issues with that. So the issue is, a couple of the issues with the situation. In this one, when David spoke to HR in person, there was no paper trail regarding the decision, right? In this case, something like, even an email or a documented conversation would have helped them down the road. Reason for that was on Wednesday, remember, they made the decision on Monday and then we're going to terminate till Friday. On Wednesday, Jane told HR she needed to take leave due to a medical condition. And to compound the problem, up until now, Jane hasn't been disciplined in writing, and her most recent performance review was positive. So if you go back in Jane's file, the most recent documentation has been a positive one, right? So what do we do here? Well, honestly, because the performance went undocumented, I mean, if the company were to terminate, from looking at it from outside, the only factors that you have to consider are her last review was very positive. She informed the company she had a medical issue. She was terminated immediately after informing them. At this point, even though it might not be the case, it looks retaliatory. And if a terminator, the company could be facing legal issues on this one, right? And that's why firing fast and documenting is so important. So in this case, if all documentation, if all the previous issues have been documented, everything was in place, once that decision was made on that Monday, there shouldn't have been a reason not to move into a termination action that very same day, or at the very latest the following day. It's when you have that long delay in between making the decision and actually doing something that there's the opportunity for things to happen, like this claim of a medical issue, injuries in the workplace. A lot of other things can happen in between there. So once you make the decision and once you decide you have everything in line, you should move forward with that termination. So what can we do in this situation? Well, in this case, it's important to know that if you have a problem employing, they tell you they're part of a protected class, whether it's a medical issue, pregnancy, some kind of disability, that sort of thing, we always advise, you want to consult legal counsel immediately if you're still planning to move forward with that termination, right? Every situation is different, but consulting with your legal counsel, they can give you what your risks are and really what you're looking at with the situation if you decide to move forward. Some other options, of course, you could allow some time to lapse. So for example, in this case, the cautious approach would be let her go on leave, wait to see how she performs when she comes back, right? I mean, it's may not sit well, but at the same time, it could be the safest course of action in this case. Make sure you're documenting the performance issues, right? Whether it's write-ups, progressive discipline, putting the employee on a performance improvement plan, whatever it is, make sure that we're doing it. It's always best practice to wait for an employee to commit another policy violation before terminating in this case, especially if there is no record or anything that's been previously documented, right? You may have to wait until the next incident after documenting the current one, so you can establish those building blocks in this case. And again, if you're adamant about terminating, or you think that it's serious enough to terminate, make sure you consult legal counsel again, just to take a look at what the risks involved and what you could be looking at down the road. Okay. So in order for a termination to be seen as lawful, we have 3 steps or 3 things that we have to make sure of, right? So the reason for termination has to be lawful. We can't terminate somebody because, they're too old, or because we only want women, or we only want men in our work group. So that's why we're terminating. There's got to be a legal reason for termination, right? We have to determine what type of separation it is. And we'll talk about this, the different kinds and how the things involved with them. And then, of course, so it's to go along with documentation, we want to make sure that we have the proper paperwork in place when we go through the termination process. One thing that always comes up when we talk about termination, of course, is California being an at-will employment state. So, and what at-will employment states that the employment relationship is at will and can be terminated by either the employer or the employer with or without cause or advance notice. So on its face, it seems like a green light to terminate anybody for any reason, right? However, you cannot terminate someone in violation of public policy. So in other words, if they filed a complaint, there's whistleblower protections. If you fire somebody based on protected status, again, if you fire somebody because their age, their race, gender, their sexual preference, because they're pregnant, that sort of thing, those are all illegal and would get you in trouble for that, to say the least. So it's always best to practice documentation, and show that you have a legitimate reason for terminating. Even if your reason is legitimate, you want to make sure that you have that documentation to back you up in case there's any claims on the contrary. So let's look at these a little bit more in depth. Step 1, make sure that the termination is lawful, right? And some common reasons for lawful terminations, of course, violation of work rules or policies. And again, the employee should be familiar with the policies or the work rules, right? Poor work performance. Again, they should know what the expectations are. You can't have somebody on, super secret probation or whatever it was, like an Animal House, and then terminate them for it, right? We have to make sure our employees know what's expected of them, what the policies are, and that they accept that responsibility before we can do any termination for it legally. A reduction in force or a layoff. And then some other reasons, dishonesty, disloyalty, conflict of interest, that sort of thing. And those are some where, documentation is going to help you down the road. Now, one thing to talk about, again, going back to reduction in force or layoffs, if you as an organization are looking to take a drastic step like that with your workforce, make sure that you've established some kind of criteria for the layoff or for the reduction in force, right? Whether it's certain positions, certain departments, whether you're using documented performance or seniority, whatever it is, make sure that that's documented and make sure that that is applied consistently throughout the workforce, right? A lot of times we're asked, well, do I have to give somebody a written, verbal, or a verbal, a written, and then a final warning before we terminate them? Again, that depends on what your specific company policy is. It's not legally required to have a 3 strikes or you're out rule, or to have a verbal and a written or whatever. There's no legal requirement for that, but it's just whatever you establish as your policy. And something we always advise to is to avoid using the terms probationary period or progressive discipline, whether it's in your policies or your handbooks, right? Reason for that is, if you do use them, make sure that you don't alter the at-will nature of employment, right? So in other words, if you say, the employee has a 90-day probationary period, after which point, we will evaluate their performance or what have you, that could be interpreted as there's a 90 days 90-day, almost a free period where you will not address those probationary issues, right? So just be very careful if you're using those terms, how you use them, how they're integrated, so that you don't paint yourself into a corner, really. Okay. So let's talk about, again, not to be the dead horse here, but documentation. Again, it's something that, we keep going back to, because honestly, if it's not in writing, if it's not documented, for the most part, it didn't happen, right? So we want to make sure that we're using the documentation. Again, if it's something for somebody that's not performing well, we want to make sure that the documentation includes that the person was aware of what the expectations were, they knew how to perform the job, or they had the knowledge, and they still fail to do it, right? We want to make sure that we gave people the tools to succeed, and if they failed, it was on their own accord, and then we want to document that, right, if that's the case. Now, when it comes time, if it's documenting something for violation of a company policy, we want to make sure that we have documentation showing that they know about the rule in advance. There was some kind of warning about violating the rule. So whether it's a signed form saying that they received a policy or they're aware of it, as well as the consequences, and giving them the opportunity to improve before being fired. So again, documenting, and this is where if you give somebody an employee handbook, make sure that you're documenting that they received it, understand it, agree to abide by it. Now, we mentioned determine different types of separation. So we have, the first one is resignation or voluntary quit, right? And that's when the employee resigns their position, chooses to leave either with or without notice. Refusal to accept available work, that is when an employee just refuses to accept work that's appropriate to their health, that's consistent with their experience or earnings, right? That's not saying that, if you had a CEO and you eliminated their position and the only thing available for them is a janitorial position or something, that's not really going to work in this case, where you say, well, they refused available work, that's all we had. That doesn't really work. It's got to be something that's at least comparable to where they were. Job abandonment, that's a lot of people use to refer to no-call, no-shows, or employee just stopped showing up. So make sure you take a look at your policy and how that is defined, because that's defined differently by every company, right? Some say, if you don't call us or don't show up for 3 days, we're considered job abandonment. Some others say 1 day, others say a week. So that's going to vary by company, but make sure that is well defined in your policy. Termination, discharge, or layoff. Again, termination of employment could be for different reasons. Discharge, layoff, different names, different things associated with them, right? The important thing with those three, though, think about it. When it's a termination, of discharge, or a layoff, it is the company that's initiating that action. So when that happens, you have to provide written notice of the involuntary termination. And of course, you have to have their final pay available immediately. So if you're terminating, discharging, or laying somebody off, the minute those words leave your mouth that, we're terminating your employment, we're discharging you, we're laying you off, you have to be able to hand them over that check immediately. When those words are said, right? You have to have it in hand so they can walk out of that meeting with that final pay. So let's talk a little bit about conducting that final meeting when you are going to if you do get to the point where you have to terminate somebody. What are some pointers for it? And the best thing we can say, I mean, these things are not easy. They make it easier over time. I don't know what that says about people if they get easier over time, but they're not easy to do. So, thing to keep in mind is we don't want to sugarcoat it, right? It is bad news. So, we're going to talk, we're going to talk through a situation, right? But some things to keep in mind is, we're not there to humiliate or embarrass somebody, right? I mean, this is it's not a pleasant situation either for the person doing the termination or the person being terminated, right? So, want to avoid sending mixed messages, telling the employer like, oh, I'm sure you'll find a new job soon, or hey, if it were up to me, I wouldn't have fired you, that sort of thing. I know we may just be trying to make the person feel better, but those are the kinds of statements that get us in trouble, right? Don't tell the employee how to feel. Oh, you'll feel better tomorrow, this will pass. We never know what people are going through. So, we're just gonna show empathy, but we're not gonna tell them how to feel, right? And again, don't act guilty. This isn't about how we as a person doing the terminating feel, right? I'm sorry, this is harder for me than for you. Oh, if it were up to me, I wouldn't have fired you. Don't use those terms, please. So some of the tips for the things you should do, or how to fire somebody, I guess, if you will. So you want to schedule a meeting in private, and remember that meeting is compensable time, right? So if you need somebody to come in for the day to do it, pay them for the time that they will be there. Okay. Again, even if they only have them come in for 10 minutes, keep in mind reporting time pay laws. be honest, polite, and businesslike, right? We're going to get to the point, stick to the facts, whether we're terminating somebody because of a safety violation, because of attendance issues or what have you, we're just going to stick to the facts. Again, that's what our documentation should be, just documenting facts of the matter. That's what we're going to focus on in this final meeting. Again, being brief as possible. This isn't going to be a long conversation, because at this point we should have all the documentation, everything in line. There's no turning back at this point, right? So there's no need for a long, drawn-out discussion at this point. We're going to be brief and specific, and what we like to advise is 10 minutes or less, right? You inform of the decision, review any paperwork that's necessary, and part ways. And why is this important? Well, the Ohio State University did a study and talked to people that had been either terminated or let go, and what their impression was of how they were treated, right? And the resulting things. And people who felt that they weren't treated with respect during the termination process, whether they were talked down to, or they just felt that disrespect in one way or another, there was a higher percentage of them that would consider some kind of legal action, or actually did pursue legal action, than those that felt they were treated respectfully at a termination. And some people say, well, you're firing somebody, there's no way to treat somebody respectfully. There is. Again, we're sticking to the facts, and there's people that are going to want to vent or talk to us about it or what have you. If you stick to the facts and treat somebody respectfully, there is a bigger chance that you will avoid any kind of litigation or legal issue afterwards. Now, I mentioned when there's a termination, we want to make sure that we are providing the appropriate or required paperwork for that. So if we're terminating somebody, we want to make sure we give them some kind of documented change in relationship, right? There's a change in relationship form stated, effective on such and such date, your employment has been terminated for whatever reason. And there's a lot of templates out there you can use. We offer one for our members as well. If we're terminating somebody, we're given the EDD, they call it Form DE 2320. I call it the little blue booklet, which the EDD provides. That just informs them of their rights as former employees. Health insurance premium payment, COBRA forms if applicable. So if you provide any documentation, you're going to give any COBRA forms, or contact the carrier, let them know of the separation so they can follow through with their COBRA process. And finally, and possibly most importantly, final paycheck with all wages, bonuses, everything earned up to date, and any accrued vacation or PTO. Now remember, sick time, if you track it separately, sick time you are not required to pay in the state of California, but any kind of vacation, PTO, anything that is accrued or earned has to be paid upon termination. And for CA members, of course, we do have a terminations checklist available on our website. So a couple questions that we asked from time to time. Can an employer ever withhold a final check? I'd ask the audience, but I mean, in this case, the answer is always no. Again, wages, final pay is due upon termination. And some people ask, well, what if they haven't returned their computer or their phone or whatever? You have to go for other means to get that, because final pay per the state of California is due upon termination. Now, when it comes to commissions or expense reimbursements, any commissions, and again, look at your specific organization's commission statements. Anything that has not been quote unquote earned yet, or anything where payment has not been received from the customer yet, can be exempt from final wage payments, right? But again, look at your specific policy when it comes to commissions. As far as expense reimbursements, those two can be made at the normal time of payment. So if you have like a once a month, you cut reimbursements checks, or end of the week or what have you, you can follow that schedule for those. So again, take a look at your policy for any kind of commissions or expense reimbursements. And finally, what if you prepaid some vacation to your employee, or if they owe you money or anything like that? We cannot deduct that from the final pay. That final pay has to be all the hours, everything that they are owed. So hopefully, if you are doing cash advances or loans or anything, there is some kind of other documentation that the employee has signed that will protect you to help that be paid back, but you cannot just unilaterally choose to deduct that from the final check. Any deduction has to be agreed upon by the employee as well. So some other tips, final pay should be a live check or a manual check, paid at the employee's primary work location. So again, if the employee works remotely 100% of the time, then that is going to be their primary work location. If they come into the office 4 days a week and work remotely 1 day a week, you could have them come into the office for that final pay. So just whatever their primary work location is, that's where that live check should be delivered. And in some cases that could mean either mailing that final check, FedExing it, whatever your carrier of choice is. So, in those cases, if you have to mail that check, I mean, we usually ask that you have some kind of a request or something from the employee asking you in writing to mail that check to them, just to avoid any kind of fees or anything. So for example, if you mail a final payment to an employee without them requesting and it gets lost in the mail, their neighbor steals their mail or something, you could be liable for waiting time penalties until they get that final payment in their hands. I always like to throw the slide up too. When we talk about payment, what an accurate wage statement looks like. Make sure that you're listing all of these elements, whether it's total hours worked, any accruals, right? So any vacation time that they've accrued, that sort of thing, pay rates, make sure that those are all always on your wage statement, including that final pay wage statement. Okay. I talked about penalties too. What happens if you don't get that final pay on time, you don't issue that final check, it gets lost or what have you. Keep in mind an employee may file a claim for any unpaid wages going back to 3 years, right? Now, it doesn't mean you have to pay them waiting time penalties for those 3 years, but you could pay waiting time penalties for up to 30 days. And on top of that, there could be some interest due on that. So, that's why it's so important to make sure that you have that process, as streamlined as possible, right? So whenever you're going to terminate somebody, you know how to request that final check, you have it in hand, you're ready to hand it over to them immediately upon termination. As you can see, failure to pay minimum wage, there's, fees that could really start adding up. So if you think about a lost final check, something you mailed without authorization that never got there, something, things can add up really quickly. Now, when it comes to sharing the news with coworkers too, this isn't something where you just let somebody go and just move up along your day without mentioning them like they never existed, right? It's going to be noticed by coworkers. So our best tip for that is always be professional with how you share that information, right? It can be consistent, discreet as possible. So basically, we're going to tell coworkers, this person's no longer with the company. Tell them how it's going to impact them, right? Whether the team's going to be shorthanded for the foreseeable future, or if that's just going to be a permanent change, if you're going to replace them, how is that going to affect the rest of the workforce, right? If they start asking you what happened, why'd you let them go, that sort of thing, just, again, be very discreet, right? Saying, this person is no longer with the company, the company separate employment, this is how it's going to affect you. That's it. No reason we're not going to share details. We're not going to, tell our side of the story or anything. We're just going to stick to the facts, short and sweet in this case. Obviously people may want to talk about it, hear them out, address their concerns as how it will affect them, but don't go into the situation into detail. Okay. So some words of wisdom or some things we like to share, of course, is get ready from the time you hire somebody to the time you fire somebody, right? Hire slow, fire fast. You're documenting along the way. You have processes in place to address any issues, hopefully. And if you don't, you can always establish them, make sure you announce them, make sure that your team is aware of them, right? And making the best out of bad situations. Sometimes, separations, terminations are traumatic for workforces, but sometimes good things can come of them, right? Maybe you re-examine the position and realize you need somebody different there, or you find a way to do things differently. So, we're making the best out of a bad situation and ending things on the most positive note possible, right? So to wrap up, just some final pointers. Make sure to develop and maintain a strong documentation. Again, from the time somebody's hired to the time they walk out that door for the last time. We want to make sure we're documenting both things, positive and negative, in a consistent, clear, concise manner. Be a coach to your employees, right? Our job as leaders is to help our employees grow, to help them develop, to help them overcome any obstacles. And how do we help them overcome those obstacles? Are we going to turn our back on them and hope to do their best, or are we going to teach them along the way? Think about the consequences, whether it's for actions or for, what happens for any kind of policy violations, right? What's going to happen with our actions? Always think about the consequences. Be respectful when we're separating with employees, even if it's, a very serious violation of policy. We still want to treat somebody with as much respect as we expect on the way out the door. Best practices, consistency, having that good documentation, that's going to keep you out of trouble. Or if you do find yourself in trouble afterwards, as long as you've been consistent and have that good, clear, concise documentation going down the road, that's going to be a great help for you. And finally, final paychecks, make sure that they're accurate, right? Work with your payroll department if it's separate from you. Make sure that you have a good system in place for reporting everything that's needed and for having that final paycheck in a timely manner. Now, we are pretty close to the 1 hour mark here. I don't know if we have any questions floating around out there, Mary. I know you've been pretty busy over there.
Yes, I'm realizing I do not type as quickly as I used to type. We had some great questions, and I will just kind of summarize. I'll let you catch your breath. Thank you for all that info. I had a couple of questions on final paycheck. So just as a reminder, anytime the employer is the moving party on ending the relationship, someone comes into your office and you say, this is your last day, you need to have that live check ready to present to them. And just like Eli was saying, it has all wages through that day, any accrued and unused vacation. You don't have to pay out sick time unless you have a PTO plan that's all wrapped up together. If for some reason you have an employee who goes AWOL on you and they disappear and you follow your no call, no show policy and you have a final paycheck that you're trying to get to them, just make sure that you do what you're supposed to do. So you've got a final paycheck. It is ready for that employee at their regular work location. And you can call them and say, you've been terminated due to job abandonment, but we have your check here. I know a lot of times they won't respond or you can't get a hold of them. You can send a certified letter saying, we've got your paycheck here. It's been ready for you since this date. And then it's really up to the employee to come and get it. Now they can ask for it to be sent to them, but you want to get something in writing. Don't just automatically put it into the mail. You don't want to do that because like Eli was saying, they can get lost, crazy things happen. So just make sure you're really following those rules, but you just want to make sure you're doing everything you can as an employer to make sure you've got that final pay so you don't get those scary waiting time penalties that you heard about.
Yeah, absolutely. And those add up really quickly, unfortunately. So
They do.
thank you, Mary. I will put up some codes here. I know most people join us just for fun, but if you are pursuing any additional education credits, we do have the codes for HRCI, which is 606287. 606287, and then for SHRM 22-J77AU, 22-J77AU, and whatever you do not forget that dash, please. Don't do it.
Don't do it. Otherwise, you won't get your credit.
That's right. We do have the hotlines here again for you. Hopefully, if you have your phones on hand or a quick screenshot or something, give us a call. Like I said, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know you saw us on this webinar, what you enjoyed, what you didn't enjoy. Please let us know. And if you want to tell us over the phone, we also have a lovely, lovely way for you to give us some feedback here.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks everybody for all the great questions, and Mary, of course, them. It's just always great to have that kind of interaction with everybody. I'm going to go ahead and put those codes in the chat as well, just so you have them if you need to go ahead and grab those. And like Eli said, this is a QR code. If you just snap a quick picture of it, it'll take you over to our survey. There's 6 questions maybe, and we would just really love your feedback. So please do that. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate it. I know there's a long list of phone numbers, so hopefully you got that and you can call in on one of those. We are here to help you, and you call us. So with all of that said and done, everybody go out and be healthy, stay safe, and have a great holiday. Thanks, everybody. Take care.